What if I told you there was a punishment so terrifying, so methodically cruel, it makes a headsman's axe look like a swift mercy? A form of torture so perverse, its victims didn't simply die, they were forced to witness their own slow decline, to feel themselves weakened day by agonizing day, fully conscious within a prison of their own living flesh. For centuries, this method was a whispered legend, a punishment so profane its very existence was dismissed as impossible, too nightmarish for even the cruelest minds to invent. Its purpose wasn't merely to kill, but to unmake a person, to meticulously erase their humanity, and turn them into a living monument of suffering and decline. This is the chilling story of Scaphism, Persia's most ingenious and terrible punishment, designed not just to kill, but to stretch the very concept of dying beyond human endurance. And Mithridates, who dared to rebel against the empire, has become its unwilling testament. How did a man who once commanded armies end up here, trapped between planks of wood, counting his remaining moments not in days, but in the weakening rhythm of his own pulse? To understand this impossible cruelty, we need to go back to when Mithridates still believed he could defy the Persian Empire and live to tell the tale. But this grotesque spectacle, this monument to suffering, wasn't where his story began, not by a long shot. So, how did a Persian soldier, a man who once fought for his king, end up here? To answer that, we have to rewind, all the way back to before the nightmare truly began. In ancient Persia, justice wasn't just blind, it was brutal. An eye for an eye wasn't a metaphor, it was a promise. And sometimes, that was the merciful option. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Indus to the Mediterranean, maintained order through terror. Their legal system, built on the principle of lex talionis, demanded visceral, tangible retribution. You stole? They cut off your hand. You lied in court? They cut out your tongue. You killed? Well, death came for you, but not always quickly. Here's the thing: the Persians had this peculiar rule about capital punishment. They called it the two strikes system. If you committed a crime worthy of death, the judges wouldn't execute you immediately. No, they'd dig into your past, weighing your previous good deeds against this single transgression. It offered a precarious hope, a chance that your life's work might save you, but commit a second capital offense? That hope evaporated like water in the desert sun. The countdown to your end became inexorable. For those accused of capital crimes, a single misstep, a past mistake, could mean everything. The judges, sitting in their courts, held absolute power over life and death, and they knew what awaited those who failed in their duties. Take Judge Sesamnes, for instance. He was corrupted by bribes and perverted justice for gold. When King Cambyses II discovered this betrayal, he didn't just execute the corrupt judge. That would be too simple, too forgettable. Instead, he ordered the ultimate punishment for judicial corruption. Cambyses had a chair crafted from the judge's skin and placed it in the very courtroom where Sesamnes once presided. Then, and get this, he appointed Sesamnes' own son as the new judge, forcing him to deliver verdicts from that grisly throne every single day. Imagine it. Every case heard, every judgment rendered, while sitting upon this macabre reminder. The psychological terror was absolute. The message was crystal clear: betray the king's justice, and your punishment would echo through generations. The new judge understood the weight of his position with every moment in that courtroom. Citizens entering saw the infamous chair, a monument to the price of corruption. The very furniture of justice had become an instrument of terror and warning. This was the world where laws weren't just written in stone, but carved into flesh and memory, where kings ruled through calculated cruelty, and where a single wrong word, a moment's pride, could unleash horrors beyond imagination. The empire's subjects lived in constant awareness that their rulers possessed not just the power to kill, but the creativity to make death itself seem like mercy. And just when you thought the depths of royal vengeance had been plumbed, history proves you wrong. Because the skin chair of Sesamnes? That was just the beginning. The Achaemenid kings had refined torture into an art form, each ruler seemingly trying to outdo his predecessors in inventive brutality. Records speak of punishments that stretched the very definition of human endurance. There was the triple death, a sentence so cruel it required teams of physicians to keep the victim alive between each stage. The condemned would face 3 separate ordeals, each worse than the one before, designed to bring them to the brink of death, only to be nursed back to health for the next phase. Some endured this cycle 3, 4, even 5 times before death finally claimed them. The psychological torment of knowing what awaited was often worse than the physical ordeal itself. This was the world Artaxerxes II inherited, a world where cruelty was a tool of statecraft. But even Cambyses' skin chair paled in comparison to the torments some kings could devise for those who truly angered them. And King Artaxerxes was about to be very, very angered. It was a story as old as time, brother against brother, for the throne, for everything. King Artaxerxes II, ruler of the mighty Persian Empire, faced the ultimate challenge from his own blood, Cyrus the Younger. The year was 401 BC, and the Persian Empire trembled on the edge of civil war. Cyrus, the younger brother, had everything: charm, military genius, the loyalty of Greek mercenaries, and most dangerously, ambition that burned like Greek fire. He wanted what his older brother possessed, the throne of the known world. Artaxerxes felt the threat in his very bones. Every night, he'd wake in cold sweats, imagining his brother's armies marching closer. The king's spies brought reports that chilled his blood. Cyrus was gathering forces, making alliances, preparing for the strike that would either crown him or kill him. There was no middle ground in dynastic struggles. You won everything, or you lost your head. The pressure on Artaxerxes was crushing. His courtiers whispered behind silk curtains, some already calculating which brother would prove victorious. The empire's satraps hedged their bets, sending token support while keeping their best troops in reserve. Even the king's own guards eyed him differently, wondering if they were protecting a dead man walking. Here's what made it worse. Cyrus wasn't just any rebel. He'd been their mother's favorite, groomed for greatness, given the best education and military training the empire could provide. While Artaxerxes had learned statecraft in the palace, Cyrus had learned war in the field. The younger brother's reputation preceded him like a shadow. Cities surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. The entire empire held its breath. A single battle would decide it all. Artaxerxes knew this. In the war councils, his generals argued strategy, while the king's mind raced with darker thoughts. Victory would mean survival, but at what cost? How many would die so one brother could rule? And worse, what if he lost? What tortures would Cyrus devise for the brother who'd kept him from his rightful throne? But Artaxerxes had advantages too: the weight of tradition, the established bureaucracy, the simple fact that he already sat on the throne. These things mattered. More importantly, he had the royal guard, 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors who'd sworn to die before letting harm come to the King of Kings. They called themselves the Immortals, because whenever one fell, another immediately took his place. Their loyalty was absolute, their skill legendary. As spring turned to summer, the inevitable approached. Scouts reported Cyrus moving north with his army, no longer hiding his intentions. The rebel prince had recruited Greek hoplites, promising them glory and gold. These were veterans of countless battles, their bronze shields and disciplined formations a match for any Persian force. Artaxerxes' advisors grew increasingly nervous. Some suggested negotiation, partition of the empire. The king silenced them with a look that could freeze blood. Artaxerxes stood before a massive map of his empire, ivory markers showing the movement of armies like pieces in the world's deadliest game. His brother's forces were marked in red, the color of warning. His own forces in gold, the color of royalty and the sun. Soon, these markers would meet, and when they did, only one set would remain standing. The king's fingers traced the likely battlefield, a place called Cunaxa, not far from Babylon. Flat plains, good for cavalry, with the Euphrates providing a natural barrier on one flank. It would be there. He could feel it in his bones. Brother would face brother under the burning Mesopotamian sun, and the fate of the greatest empire on earth would be decided by sword and spear. What terrified Artaxerxes most wasn't death, it was the possibility of capture. Persian tradition demanded specific tortures for usurpers and false claimants to the throne. If Cyrus won, if he took Artaxerxes alive, the king had seen what happened to rebels. He'd ordered such punishments himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that he might suffer the very torments he'd inflicted on others. So when the day came, when the dust clouds of approaching armies darkened the horizon, Artaxerxes donned his armor, with the knowledge that this day would end with one brother dead and the other securing his throne in blood. The king mounted his chariot, surrounded by his immortals, and prepared to meet his destiny. He had no idea that the battle's outcome would hinge not on the brothers' rivalry, but on the accidental thrust of a common soldier's spear. Armies were marching. The fate of Persia hung precariously in the balance, soon to be decided on the crimson-stained fields of Cunaxa. And one young soldier, entirely unknown, was about to step directly into the path of history, sealing not only Cyrus's fate, but his own horrific destiny. The air at Cunaxa was thick with dust, the sounds of battle, and the cries of dying men. Cyrus the Younger, a whirlwind of fury, was carving his way towards his brother, victory almost in his grasp. And then, from the chaos, a single javelin flew, thrown by a young soldier named Mithridates. The battle had erupted with the rising sun. Tens of thousands of men collided in a storm of bronze and iron. The Greek mercenaries, fighting for Cyrus, smashed into the Persian lines like a hammer striking clay. Their disciplined phalanx proved devastating, pushing back the king's forces step by bloody step. On the flanks, cavalry wheeled and charged. Arrows darkened the sky, and the ground became a crimson mire from the carnage and trampled earth. Mithridates was just another face in the sea of warriors, a young Persian soldier, probably in his 20s, serving in one of the regular infantry units. Not an immortal, not a nobleman, just a man with a spear and a prayer that he'd survive to see sunset. He'd trained for this, drilled until his hands bled, but nothing prepares you for the reality of battle, the grim realities of the battlefield, the chaotic sounds of combat, the way dying men call for their mothers. Through the swirling melee, Cyrus the Younger appeared like a figure from legend. The rebel prince had abandoned caution, leading from the front, his royal purple cloak making him unmistakable. This was his moment of destiny. He'd spotted his brother's standard in the distance and was cutting a path straight toward it. Persian soldiers fell back before his fury. Victory seemed inevitable. But here's where fate played its cruelest joke. Mithridates, pressed by the surge of battle, fighting for his life in the chaotic scrum, saw an enemy warrior breaking through the lines. Just another target in purple, just another threat to eliminate. His training took over. The javelin left his hand in a perfect arc, the kind of throw he'd practiced 1,000 times. Mithridates likely didn't even know who he'd hit, not at first. In the dust and confusion, with men dying all around, one fallen enemy was just another casualty. But this was no ordinary warrior. The javelin struck true, finding its mark, and Cyrus the Younger, the great rebel, the would-be king, stumbled. For a moment, just a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Then the prince fell from his horse, his life draining onto the thirsty ground of Cunaxa. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A cry went up, "Cyrus is fallen! The prince is dead!" The rebel army, moments before on the edge of victory, wavered. Their champion, their reason for fighting, lay dying in the dust. The Greek mercenaries, suddenly realizing they were now fighting for a corpse, began their fighting retreat. Persian royal forces, sensing the tide turning, pressed forward with renewed vigor. And in all that chaos, Mithridates still didn't fully grasp what he'd done. He was just trying to survive, parrying strikes, shield-bashing enemies, praying to Ahura Mazda that he'd live through this nightmare. Around him, the battle continued to rage, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Without Cyrus, the rebellion had no head, no purpose. It was already beginning to dissolve. It wasn't until later, when the fighting finally ended and the sun began its descent, painting the battlefield in shades of red that matched the stained earth, that Mithridates learned the truth. Fellow soldiers, faces still marked by the fierce battle, clapped him on the back. "You're the one," they said. "You killed the traitor prince. You saved the empire." The young soldier's mind reeled. He'd thrown dozens of javelins that day, desperately fighting for survival. But one of them, one single throw in the chaos of battle, had changed everything. He'd accidentally become the hero of Cunaxa, the man who'd preserved Artaxerxes' throne. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Officers came to look at him, this common soldier who'd done what all the immortals couldn't. But even as his fellow soldiers celebrated, even as wine was pressed into his hands and his name was cheered, a cold dread began to settle in Mithridates' stomach. He'd killed the king's brother. Yes, a rebel, a traitor but still royal blood. In the Achaemenid Empire, even justified killings of royalty carried weight, carried consequences. What would the king think? What would he do? As night fell over the battlefield, as the screams of the wounded echoed through the darkness and funeral pyres began to light the sky, Mithridates sat by his unit's fire, staring into the flames. He couldn't shake the image of that purple-cloaked figure falling, couldn't forget the way the javelin had felt leaving his hand. One throw, one accident of war, and now he was famous or infamous. Little did he know, his troubles were just beginning, because while his fellow soldiers saw a hero, King Artaxerxes would soon hear a very different story. A story about a common soldier who dared to steal the glory that belonged to the King of Kings alone. A story that would transform an accidental hero into a deliberate threat to royal dignity. Cyrus, the great rebel, fell. The rebellion shattered with him. The day was Artaxerxes. But for Mithridates, the man whose javelin found its accidental mark, the battle was over. His nightmare, however, was just beginning, and he had absolutely no idea. The fighting was done. The survivors, drunk on relief and cheap wine, celebrated. And among them, flushed with adrenaline, Mithridates made his boast. "It was my spear," he declared. "My spear that brought down the rebel Cyrus." The victory feast was in full swing. Soldiers who hours before had been certain of death now laughed, sang bawdy songs, and drank themselves stupid. They'd survived Cunaxa. They'd crushed the rebellion. They were heroes, every one of them, and the wine flowed like the Euphrates itself. Mithridates found himself at the center of attention. His unit had made him their champion, pushing cups into his hands, demanding he tell the story again and again. And why not? He was young, alive, and had just become the luckiest soldier in the Persian army. The wine was strong, the praise intoxicating, and common sense had fled with sobriety. "Tell us again," his comrades shouted. "Tell us how you spotted the traitor." And Mithridates, his tongue loosened by alcohol and adulation, obliged. With each retelling, the story grew. What had been a desperate, chaotic moment became a tale of skill and destiny. The accidental throw became a calculated strike. The confusion of battle transformed into clarity of purpose. "I saw him there," Mithridates slurred, gesturing wildly with his cup. "Purple cloak flying, cutting through our brothers like wheat, and I thought someone has to stop him. So I took my javelin, aimed true, and sent that traitor to the dust where he belonged." The soldiers cheered. More wine appeared. But here's the thing, among those celebrating soldiers were men with ambitious hearts and loose tongues. Men who knew that information was currency in the Persian court. And what they heard wasn't just a soldier's boast. It was intelligence worth its weight in gold. Word of the soldier's claim spread like wildfire through the camp, and then, to the king's ears, it moved up the chain of command with terrifying speed. From soldier to squad leader to officer, officer to general, and finally, inevitably, to the royal tent where Artaxerxes II sat receiving reports of his victory. Now, you have to understand something crucial. Artaxerxes had already issued his official version of events. According to the King of Kings, he had personally slain his rebellious brother in single combat. It was a lie, of course. Artaxerxes had been nowhere near Cyrus when he fell. But truth mattered less than narrative. The story of brother killing brother in righteous combat was powerful, mythic. It established Artaxerxes not just as the survivor, but as the divine instrument of justice. This narrative was already spreading throughout the empire. Royal messengers carried the news. The King of Kings, blessed by Ahura Mazda, struck down the traitor Cyrus with his own hand, proving once again that rebellion against the rightful ruler is doomed by heaven itself. So when word reached Artaxerxes that some common soldier was claiming credit for killing Cyrus, the king's reaction was volcanic. His advisors watched in terror as the royal face transformed from satisfaction to rage. The cup in his hand bent under his grip, wine spilling across the Persian carpets. "Bring me this soldier," Artaxerxes commanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Bring me this Mithridates who thinks he can steal glory from the King of Kings." The court fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. In the Achaemenid Empire, challenging the king's narrative wasn't just insubordination, it was cosmic rebellion. It suggested that a common soldier, not the divinely appointed ruler, had shaped the fate of the empire. It undermined everything, called into question the very order of the universe as the Persians understood it. But Mithridates, still drunk in his tent, knew nothing of this. He continued his celebrations, basking in his newfound fame, completely unaware that his boastful words had just signed a death warrant with his own words. His fellow soldiers, beginning to sober up, started to realize the magnitude of what was happening. Some tried to warn him, to tell him to retract his claims, to say he was mistaken, drunk, confused. It was too late. Royal guards were already on their way, their bronze armor glinting in the torchlight as they marched through the camp. Soldiers scattered before them like leaves before a storm. These weren't just any guards, they were the king's personal enforcers, men who'd carried out royal justice before and would do so again without hesitation. When they reached Mithridates' tent, they found him still celebrating, still unaware of his doom. The sight of the royal guards sobered him instantly. The cup fell from his nerveless fingers as understanding dawned. He'd claimed to have killed Cyrus, the king's brother, and the king had heard. Mithridates, the guard captain announced, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority. By order of the King of Kings, you will come with us. Now. There was no resistance. How could there be? Mithridates rose on unsteady legs, his fellow soldiers backing away as if his doom might be contagious. As the guards flanked him, as the iron grip of consequences closed around him, one thought echoed through his wine-addled mind. What had he done? The march to the royal tent felt like a funeral procession. Other soldiers watched from the shadows, whispering among themselves. They all knew the stories, knew what happened to those who displeased the King of Kings. Some made signs against evil, others simply turned away, not wanting to witness what came next. Artaxerxes listened, his face a mask of cold fury. A common soldier, stealing his glory? This was more than an insult. It was a challenge to his very authority. The king would make an example. And for Mithridates, his proud words had just signed his own agonizing, terrifyingly slow death warrant. For the crime of stealing a king's glory, a swift death was too kind. Artaxerxes II wanted more. He wanted a lesson etched in suffering, a spectacle of horror. He remembered tales, perhaps even of his own family's capacity for cruelty, like the eunuch subjected to the triple death, blinding, then flaying, then crucifixion, nursed back to health between each torment. For Mithridates, the king chose something else, something they called the boats. The royal court assembled in hushed terror. Nobles who'd witnessed countless executions found themselves unable to meet the king's eyes. They knew that mood, that particular tilt of the royal head, that meant someone was about to suffer in ways that would haunt even the executioner's dreams. Artaxerxes sat on his throne, the picture of cold deliberation. Before him, Mithridates knelt, finally understanding the magnitude of his error. The soldier's wine courage had evaporated, replaced by a fear so profound it seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. He tried to speak, to explain, to beg, but the words died in his throat at the king's raised hand. "You claim to have killed my brother," Artaxerxes said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "You, a common soldier, dare to steal the glory that heaven itself granted to the King of Kings?" The court held its breath. Some expected immediate execution, a sword stroke perhaps, or strangulation with the royal bowstring, but Artaxerxes had something far more elaborate in mind. The insult demanded not just death, but transformation from man to warning, from person to living symbol of what happened to those who challenged royal narratives. "Death is too simple for you," the king continued. "Too quick, too forgettable. No, you will become a lesson that will echo through the ages. You will experience the boat's Scaphism. Let your suffering teach others the price of stealing glory from their rightful king." A collective shudder ran through the court. Even hardened generals paled at the word. Scaphism was whispered about in dark corners, a punishment so cruel that some claimed it was myth, too horrible to be real. But those who'd served the Achaemenid kings long enough knew better. They'd seen the boats prepared, heard the screams that lasted for days, sensed the profound misery that marked a Scaphism in progress. The executioners brought forth not an axe nor a rope, but two small, ordinary-looking rowboats. To the uninitiated, they seemed almost comical, simple wooden vessels, the kind fishermen might use on calm rivers. But those who knew, those who understood, saw them for what they truly were, instruments of the slowest, most agonizing death human creativity had ever devised. Here's what made Scaphism particularly terrifying. It wasn't about inflicting wounds or breaking bones. Those were crude methods. Over too quickly. No, Scaphism was about transformation, about turning the victim's own body into the instrument of torture. It was torture elevated to an art form, refined over generations of Persian cruelty. The method had been perfected, they said, by the kings of old who understood that the greatest suffering came not from what you did to a person, but from what you made them do to themselves. The boats were shaped specifically, measured precisely, too small for comfort, too large for quick suffocation, every detail calculated for maximum prolonged agony. Mithridates watched in growing horror as the executioners began their preparations. They worked with the calm efficiency of master craftsmen, checking the boat's fittings, ensuring the holes were properly sized. One of them, an older man with dead eyes, who'd clearly done this before, actually hummed while he worked, as if preparing for nothing more significant than a day's fishing. The king's advisors provided commentary, ensuring everyone understood what was about to unfold. "The convicted will be stripped," one announced, his voice carrying across the silent court. Placed between the boats with only head, hands, and feet exposed, he will be fed a mixture of milk and honey, forced down his throat if necessary, until his body rebels against him. Another advisor continued, "The same mixture will coat his exposed flesh, drawing the creatures of the earth and sky to feast. He will lie in his own filth, as nature itself becomes his torturer. Death will come eventually, sometimes after a week, sometimes 2. The record, they say, is 20 days. What made it worse was the perversion of symbols. Milk and honey, the foods of prosperity, of abundance, of the land flowing with promise, transformed into instruments of doom. It was deliberate mockery, turning sustenance into suffering, blessing into curse. The very things that should give life would instead ensure a death so horrible that witnesses would carry the memory like a scar. The court physician was summoned not to heal, but to advise. He explained with clinical detachment how the punishment worked in stages. The victim would become increasingly weakened by the forced diet and exposure. The honey would attract various creatures, beginning a process that would lead to infection and eventual death through natural causes, accelerated by the conditions. The physician described how this method ensured prolonged suffering while technically allowing nature to take its course. The cruelty of the punishment, the physician concluded, lies not in any single violent act, but in the slow accumulation of misery. The victim remains conscious throughout their decline, aware of their fate but powerless to escape it. Some in the court turned away, others watched with the horrible fascination of those witnessing a catastrophe. But all understood the message. This is what happens when you challenge the king's truth. This is the price of stolen glory. Mithridates was stripped bare, his heart pounding with a nameless dread. The 2 boats were brought together, fitted around him like a grotesque wooden coffin, leaving only his head, hands, and feet exposed. He was trapped, utterly trapped. And then they brought out the milk and honey. Imagine it, pinned, immobile, the sun starting to bake your exposed skin, and then your captors approach, not with instruments of pain, but with food. A mixture of milk and honey, cloyingly sweet. They forced it down his throat. The first day began with almost mundane cruelty. Mithridates, trapped between the boats, could barely process what was happening. His world had shrunk to the wooden prison that held him, the rough planks pressing against his naked flesh. The boats had been fitted together with horrible precision, tight enough to completely immobilize him, but with just enough space to ensure he wouldn't suffocate quickly. The executioners approached with clay jars, and for a moment, Mithridates felt absurd hope. Food meant they wanted him alive. Maybe this was just imprisonment. Maybe the king would show mercy after a few days of discomfort. That hope died when they pried his mouth open and began pouring the mixture down his throat. The milk and honey mixture was thick, sickeningly sweet, prepared specifically for this purpose. They'd heated it just enough to make it flow easily, but not enough to provide the mercy of scalding. Mithridates tried to resist, to clench his teeth, but the executioners were experienced. They knew exactly how to force the jaw open, how to ensure every drop went down. "Swallow," one commanded, with the bored tone of someone performing routine labor. "Fighting only makes it take longer." The mixture coated his throat, its sweetness so intense it triggered his gag reflex. But they kept pouring, jar after jar, until his stomach distended with the vile feast. When he thought he could take no more, when his body screamed for relief, they produced more jars. The feeding continued until Mithridates felt he might burst from the pressure. But swallowing was only part of the torture. Next came the external application. Using brushes made from horsehair, they painted the honey mixture over every inch of exposed skin, his face, his hands, his feet. The substance was sticky, viscous, clinging to his skin like a second, suffocating layer. It filled his nostrils with its cloying scent, matted in his hair, sealed his eyes shut when he blinked. The sun, rising higher, began its work. The honey coating acted like a magnifying glass for the heat, turning his skin into a burning landscape. But worse than the heat was the invitation it represented. Already, Mithridates could hear the first scouts arriving, the buzz of flies drawn by the sweet scent. Day after day, the forced feeding continued. The sweet, sticky mixture was applied to his exposed skin, and then the true purpose of this treatment began. His body, overwhelmed by the unusual diet, began to rebel against him. The discomfort was immediate and severe, leaving him in a state of constant physical distress. The boats became a prison of misery. His condition deteriorated rapidly as the unsanitary circumstances took their toll. The honey mixture, combined with his helpless state, created conditions that no human should endure. His dignity was stripped away completely, reducing him from a proud soldier to a suffering wretch. And still they fed him. Every day, the executioners returned with their jars. They maintained the routine with methodical precision, ensuring his ordeal continued according to the king's design. By the third day, Mithridates existed in unimaginable misery. The boats had become his entire world, and that world was one of constant suffering. His exposed skin began to show signs of damage from the sun and the harsh conditions. The psychological torture was devastating. Mithridates, a soldier who'd faced death with courage, found himself utterly helpless and humiliated. The loss of dignity was complete. He'd become exactly what the king intended, not a man, but a living warning to others. But here's what made it truly diabolical. The milk and honey weren't just about causing dysentery. They served another purpose. The nutrition, minimal as it was, kept him alive. A man could survive weeks on honey alone. The milk provided just enough sustenance to prevent quick starvation. Death would not come from hunger. Oh no, it would come from something far worse. The executioners had become artists of suffering. They knew exactly how much to feed him, enough to keep his body functioning, not enough to provide any real strength. They monitored his condition with the careful attention of gardeners tending a particularly delicate plant. When his struggles grew too weak, they'd force more mixture down his throat. When he seemed too alert, they'd let the sun and flies do their work. His own body betrayed him, racked with uncontrollable diarrhea, turning his wooden prison into a sweltering, putrid swamp of his own filth. The smell alone was a torment. But the milk, the honey, the excrement, they were an open invitation, and something was coming, something far worse than the filth itself. First, it was the flies, drawn by the sweetness. Then came other insects, attracted by the honey coating and the deteriorating conditions. What followed was nature's cruelest response to the king's design. The insects arrived steadily, each type drawn by different aspects of Mithridates' predicament. The flies came in growing numbers, creating clouds around the boats. Their presence was constant and maddening, a living reminder of his helpless state. The psychological impact was devastating. Mithridates could feel the constant activity around and on his body. Every sensation was magnified by his complete inability to defend himself. The insects had found their feast, and he was powerless to stop them. As days passed, the situation grew progressively worse. The combination of exposure, forced feeding, and the insect activity created a downward spiral from which there was no escape. His body began to fail under the accumulated stress, yet consciousness remained, forcing him to experience every moment of his decline. Each sunrise brought not hope, but a renewal of the torment. The executioners continued their grim routine, maintaining the conditions that ensured his prolonged suffering. The area around the boats had become notorious throughout the city. By day 7, Mithridates had changed dramatically. His face showed the effects of days in the sun and constant insect activity. The exposure had taken a severe toll on his health. Yet somehow, impossibly, he lived. The human body's capacity for survival, usually a blessing, had become the ultimate curse. The psychological effects were profound. In his delirium, Mithridates would forget where he was, sometimes calling out as if he were back on the battlefield. Then reality would return: the boats, the insects, the endless misery. Some witnesses reported hearing him speaking to himself, his mind seeking escape in memories of better times. The execution had become a public spectacle. Citizens came to witness what happened to those who challenged the king's authority. Parents brought children as a warning. Soldiers were marched past in formation, their officers pointing out the consequences of disobedience. The message was unmistakable: this could be you. The nights brought different torments. The desert cold contrasted sharply with the daytime heat, but offered no relief from his circumstances. Different creatures emerged in the darkness, and his inability to see made every sensation more terrifying. By day 10, even the executioners were surprised he still lived. They'd seen others succumb much sooner, but Mithridates, perhaps due to his soldier's constitution, endured beyond all expectations. He'd become a living testament to human endurance under the worst possible conditions. Days 12, 13, 14 each dawn finding him still breathing, still aware of his situation. His body had become a landscape of suffering, claimed by various creatures that had made it their home. He was no longer recognizable as the proud soldier who had once served the empire. By day 15, speech had become impossible, but witnesses claimed they could still detect awareness in his eyes. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the punishment. Even as his body failed, consciousness remained, trapped, and forced to experience every moment of decline. 17 days of this unimaginable ordeal. He had become a public lesson in the king's power, his condition a constant reminder of royal authority. This was Mithridates, barely clinging to life. And so we return to where our tale began. Mithridates, 17 days into his punishment, barely recognizable as human, yet somehow still alive. The insects had claimed his body as their territory, and his condition had deteriorated beyond description, yet those eyes still held that terrible spark of awareness. On this 17th day, as the morning sun began its familiar torture, something finally gave way. Perhaps it was his heart, exhausted from fighting the spreading sepsis. Perhaps his mind, pushed beyond all human limits, simply chose to let go. Or perhaps his body, that remarkable machine that had endured far longer than anyone thought possible, finally ran out of reserves. Whatever the cause, Mithridates' breathing, ragged and wet for days, began to slow. The executioners, arriving for their morning ritual of milk and honey, found their charge on the very edge of death. They actually seemed disappointed their masterwork was ending. One prodded Mithridates with a stick, checking for response. The eyes, barely visible through the swollen insect-covered flesh, flickered one last time, and then, mercifully, nothing. 17 days. The soldier who'd accidentally killed a prince, who'd drunkenly boasted of his deed, had endured 17 days of the most exquisite torture human minds had ever devised. His death was simultaneously a relief and an anticlimax. After such spectacular suffering, the actual moment of passing seemed almost mundane. The boats were broken apart, revealing the full horror of what lay within. Even the hardened executioners stepped back from the stench and sight. What remained of Mithridates was barely recognizable as having once been human. The body was burned immediately, partly for hygiene, partly because no one wanted to handle what was left. The ashes were scattered to the winds, ensuring that nothing remained of the man who dared claim a king's glory. Now, here's where the historical record gets interesting. Everything I've just told you, this whole nightmarish saga of Mithridates and his 17 days of hell, comes to us primarily from one source, Plutarch, the Greek historian writing centuries after the events allegedly took place. Plutarch loved a good story, especially one that painted the Persians as creatively cruel. He claimed to have gotten the details from Persian sources, from people who'd witnessed or heard about the execution firsthand. But Plutarch was writing for a Greek audience that had no love for Persia. The Greeks and Persians had been enemies for generations. Wars, invasions, centuries of bad blood, all of it colored how each civilization viewed the other. So when Plutarch describes Persian punishments in lurid detail, we have to ask, was he recording history or propaganda? Was Scaphism real, or was it the ancient equivalent of an urban legend, growing more horrific with each telling? Later, historians added their own embellishments. Zonaras, writing even later, took Plutarch's account and somehow made it worse, adding details that strain credibility even by ancient standards. Each retelling seemed to add new horrors, new dimensions of cruelty. The boats became more elaborate, the suffering more baroque, the duration longer. And here's the thing that really makes you think. We have no Persian sources describing Scaphism. Not one. For a civilization that kept extensive records, that carved their laws in stone and recorded their victories in minute detail, the absence of any Persian mention of this supposedly common punishment is suspicious. The Persians wrote about other executions, other tortures. Why not this one? Some historians argue that Scaphism was real but rare, reserved for only the most extraordinary criminals. Others suggest it was entirely fictional, a Greek invention designed to make their enemies seem barbaric beyond measure. Still others propose a middle ground, that the Persians did practice some form of exposure torture involving insects, but the elaborate boat contraption was a later embellishment. But does it matter if Scaphism was real or myth? The story has endured for over 2 millennia, repeated in histories, referenced in literature, used as the ultimate example of human cruelty. Real or not, it speaks to something deep in our collective nightmare, the fear of being trapped, of being consumed, of suffering that goes on and on without hope of relief. The horror of Scaphism lies not just in its physical torments, but in its psychological ones. The complete loss of dignity, the body turned against itself, nature weaponized. Time stretched into an eternity of suffering. These fears resonate across cultures and centuries. We see echoes of Scaphism in our modern horror stories, the victim aware but helpless, consumed slowly by forces beyond their control. What Scaphism represents transcends its historical accuracy. It embodies our darkest understanding of what humans can do to each other when cruelty is given free rein and creativity. It reminds us that torture isn't just about causing pain, it's about sending messages, about power, about turning human beings into symbols. Mithridates, if he existed, wasn't just killed. He was transformed into a warning that echoed through centuries. Think about the minds that could conceive such a punishment. The careful calculation of it, selecting foods that would nourish while causing dysentery, understanding insect behavior well enough to weaponize it, knowing just how to keep someone alive while their body decomposed. This wasn't rage-driven violence. This was cruelty as science, suffering as statecraft. It reveals capacities within human nature that we'd prefer to forget exist. Whether Artaxerxes II actually condemned Mithridates to Scaphism, whether those boats really held a dying soldier for 17 days, whether the insects really came in their countless millions, these questions may never be definitively answered. But the story endures because it captures something essentially true about power, cruelty, and the lengths to which humans will go to make examples of those who challenge authority. In the end, the tale of Scaphism serves as a mirror, reflecting not just ancient Persian cruelty, real or imagined, but our own fascination with the extremes of human suffering. We tell and retell these stories, each generation finding new horror in old tales. And in that retelling, in that enduring fascination with the worst we can do to each other, perhaps we find the true horror not in the boats, not in the insects, but in the human imagination that can conceive such things and the human nature that, given the right circumstances, might even carry them out. The boats of Scaphism may be long rotted away, the executioners dust, the victims forgotten. But the idea persists, a nightmare that spans millennia, reminding us that the most terrifying monsters have always been ourselves. In our modern world of clean executions and Geneva Conventions, stories like Scaphism seem impossibly barbaric. Yet, they serve as warnings. This is what we're capable of when law becomes revenge, when justice becomes spectacle, when human beings become nothing more than messages written in suffering. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing truth of all.